Recently, I've been playing a lot of Ghost of Tsushima, which really got me into the mood for painting up some samurai. Luckily for me, the October edition of Wargames Illustrated comes with either a free sprue of Ashigaru Spearmen, Ashigaru Missile Troops, or a Samurai sprue from Warlord Games. All of these I could paint up in the colours of the clan Adachi from the game. As always, my first step was to prime the model. Primers help to create a surface that paint can properly adhere to, as well as giving us a uniform colour to start the painting process against. There are many methods of priming, be it aerosol, airbrush or brush on, and what you choose is entirely up to you, as is the colour. However, I've chosen to use a grey primer here as it will allow us to more easily apply both the lighter and dark colours that I'll be adding in the next few steps. Before I applied any paint to the model, I started by thinning down a little on my wet palette. For my base coats, I find that a mixture of roughly 2 parts paint to 1 part water is an ideal ratio, and you're looking for a consistency similar to what you see here. When painting models that I know I'll be applying a wash to, I prefer to paint all of my base coats first. This allows me to apply the washes in a single step before moving on to the highlights. I like to see the model progressing at each stage, and it prevents me from accidentally ruining a good chunk of the paint job with these often messier starting applications. With the paint ready, the first areas I painted were the male shirt, the armour around the lower legs, the feet and the helmet. The paint I've chosen for all of these areas is Necromancer Cloak. This very dark grey paint is a good substitute for using black, as it allows me to apply washes to it later on. Now, because I had thinned out the paint, I wasn't expecting perfect coverage with the first coat. After this first layer had been applied across the relevant areas and allowed to dry fully, I then went back and applied a second layer over the top. This resulted in a more solid looking base colour that I could build up from. Additionally, it helped to ensure that the paint was applied smoothly and that I wasn't left with brush marks in the paintwork. As I've already mentioned, this thinning and layering technique is something that I repeated across all of the following base coats. The next areas to base coat were the trousers and some of the banding on the armour. I wanted these to be very light grey, almost white, and so I started with some stone golem. By using a grey here, I was able to use a pure white as a highlight later on. As I wanted to give the armour a very distinct turquoise colour, I chose to use some elemental bolt. This, again, was applied in a couple of thin layers, in order to ensure that I was left with a vibrant base colour. In addition to various armour segments, I also used this particular paint to tackle some of the straps around the greaves. Next, I used the equally bright crystal blue to tackle some of the remaining cloth. These included the ties around the helmet, waist and the wrists. To paint the exposed skin of the face, I began with Kobold Skin. This gave me a good starting colour that I could build upon with some washes and highlights. I took particular care here because I didn't want to accidentally overspill onto the areas around the face that I'd already painted. However, if you do, it's fairly simple to cover them up again with your original paint. For the steel blade of the samurai sword, as well as any other areas of silver metal, I began with the darker steel colour of gunmetal. Similarly, for the gold and copper coloured metallics such as the sword's guard, the helmet ornament and some of the small inlaid details on the armour, I decided to begin with a layer of true copper. So, now that all the base colours have been applied, I could begin to apply my washes. But first, much like my base coats, I need to thin them down. Instead of using water, I use some of the Army Painter's Quickshade mixing medium. It's essentially the wash, but without any pigment in it. By mixing this in equal parts with the wash, I was able to maintain the same paint consistency but reduce the strength of the wash. This helped to create a more subtle shading. With the wash mixed, I was able to begin applying it to the miniature. The first wash I used here was dark tone, and this can be applied across the whole model, with the exception of the skin. The wash flowed into the recesses and, as it dried, darkened them down. Having darker colours in these recesses created the appearance of shadows and helped to improve the level of detail on the miniature. The only remaining area to wash at this point was the skin, and this was coated in the made for purpose flesh wash. Personally, I like to thin my mixture down for this just a little bit more than I did the last step, and apply a couple of coats rather than just the one. Doing this helped with some of the facial features and helped them to stand out a little more. After I had allowed the washes to dry, I could then start on the highlights. To paint most of these, I'll use the base colour of an area mixed with some Arid Earth to create a lighter colour. Mixing the two paints in equal quantities resulted in something that had a similar hue but was lighter. I also went about adding a little water here too, just to make the paint easy to apply. I started off with a mixture of Necromancer Cloak and Arid Earth, and used this to highlight the areas that I base coated with the Necromancer Cloak in my very first step. To highlight, I made use of a fine-tipped brush and carefully dragged the tip over the raised folds and details. I tried to focus my application of these highlights to the upper areas to help simulate how light falls. By adding lighter colours with these highlights, I created stronger contrast between these areas and the darker recesses that I created with the washes. This resulted in a much more detailed looking miniature which had more depth. Now these highlights were completely optional. I could have used the miniature as it currently stands. This would have kept the painting time down and allowed me to get a number of these models painted up in a much quicker time. But if you want your miniatures looking their best, then I would recommend adding these highlights. For the second highlight, instead of using a mixture of Stone Golem and Arid Earth, I instead used some matte white, as this will give me the brightest possible edge highlight. Once again, I thinned out the paint a little with water and carefully used a fine brush to line the edges of the areas that I painted with that Stone Golem. For the edges of the turquoise armour, I created a mixture of Elemental Bolt and Arid Earth to produce a lighter turquoise colour. Additionally, for the blue areas of the model, I highlighted with a mixture of Crystal Blue and some Arid Earth. To pick out the facial features, I used some of the lighter skin tone of Corpse Pale. Here I applied thin lines to the tops of the cheeks, the bridge of the nose and finally the lips, all to help to add more depth to them. Finally, I just needed to highlight the metallic areas. With the brighter plate mail metal, I applied thin lines down the blade's edge to create the appearance of sharpness. For the areas of gold and copper, I used some bright gold to finish them off. Once this has been completed, all I have to do was to apply a suitable basing scheme, give everything a coat of matte varnish to remove any glossy sheen, and apply some grass tufts, which should leave you with something that looks like this. And here we have the completed Samurai from Warlord Games Test of Honor. As I mentioned before, you'll find either a Samurai, an Ashigaru Spearmen, or an Ashigaru Missile Troop Sprue in the October edition of Wargames Illustrated, so keep an eye out for that magazine in your newsagents if you would like to try out these techniques. You can find a full list of all the paints that I've used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other equipment that I've used to create this video. So, as always, I just want to say a big thank you to all of my supporters and the folks who use my affiliate links. If you would like to help me out in making these videos, you can support me on Buy Me a Coffee as a one-off or as an ongoing membership, and you can find a link to that below. Your help is always greatly appreciated, and if you like this video then check out my other conversion and painting guides, and please do consider subscribing. And so until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.